Gurdjieff's Beelzebub's tales to his grandson, he relates the saga of the first great prophet to mankind, Ashiata Shiemash. Now, I won't be the first person to speculate that Ashiata Shiemash is actually a reference to the ancient Indo-Iranian prophet Zarathustra. As a student of the Gurdjieff work myself, and then later a student of Mazdaism, this question took on an increasing significance for me. What he taught was simply the original system for becoming that had just been forgotten and buried over the passage of time. And on the other side, the more one studies Zoroastrianism in particular, the more one comes to see that quite possibly this was the original way, the original spiritual teaching from which all others grew, diverged from, and eventually lost resonance and resemblance with. So here it's my wish to highlight the significant ideas and stories surrounding the character of Ashiata Shiemash. Note the various correspondences with Zarathustra, as they may arise, all in the spirit of generating a more comprehensive understanding and sense of universality and the essential nature of this line of work. There are certainly some differences between Ashiata Shiemash and Zarathustra, but there are as many, if not more, similarities, and deep ones at that. It may be useful to keep in mind that Gurdjieff never considered himself an academician. And were anyone to request academic citation on any of his ideas, he would likely scoff and point them to the door. Yet it is clear from his many writings, and the many writings about him, that he contained within himself a wealth of legitimate knowledge of man, psychology, religion, philology, or what today we'd call linguistics, and history. Most of his knowledge, he would insist, came from oral tradition, the kind of knowledge that is passed from mouth to ear. In fact, his father was an Ashak, a tribal storyteller from the rural Armenian Turkish culture that Gurdjieff grew up in. He remarked once that after the Epic of Gilgamesh was discovered and publicized in the 1850s, he then realized the power of oral tradition, for he had already been familiarized with all of the stories in this work by the oral tradition maintained by his father. So it is not only academic correspondences that we must look toward in this effort, but correspondences in pattern, archetype, resonance. Once one allows for this, one begins to see that there's actually a lot of evidence to support the notion that Ashiata Shiemash and Zarathustra are one and the same. And the most intriguing one lies right up front in the name, Ashiata Shiemash. Gurdjieff seemed to relish in dressing up and encoding references to people, places, and things throughout the work of Beelzebub's tales in a seeming spirit of obfuscation. It is said that when his students were proofreading manuscripts for him, if they too easily arrived at his meaning, he would respond, "Ah, I must bury the bone deeper then." Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson offers an entire lexicon of Greco-Armenian Russian crafted code words and new names for characters that, as your eyes adjust, slowly become familiar. For instance, Lentrohamsanen equals Lenin, Vladimir Lenin. Archangel Lucios, Lucifer, so on. In the prophet's first name, Ashiata, we find the letters spelling A-S-H-A, Asha, which is the expression of higher truth, objective consciousness, and the teachings of Zarathustra, the idea of universal order, which Gurdjieff would also reflect in his ray of creation. Of the word Asha, Dr. Flowers, in his book, The Good Religion, says, there is no adequate English translation. It connotes a synthesis of world order, truth, right, righteousness, and holiness. What of Ashiata's time and place? Does it correspond with what we know of the historical Zarathustra? Of Ashiata, it is said that he was born in Samaria 700 years before a great meeting of learned beings in the city of Babylon. Most modern scholars of Zoroastrianism generally place Zarathustra as having lived in northeast Iran or northern Afghanistan, which puts Ashiata Shiemash in generally the right place. Scholars further consider Zarathustra to have lived sometime between 1700 and 1300 BCE. The city of Babylon underwent a variety of incarnations over a sweeping period as far back as 2300 BCE during the Akkadian Empire to 539 BCE in the Neo-Babylonian era, with a cultural peak with the distinction of largest city in the world around 1770 to 1670 BCE. So time-wise, we can at least consider Ashiata Shiemash to be in the same general neighborhood as Zarathustra. Gurdjieff attributes to Ashiata many first and unique accomplishments in the areas of philosophy and initiation, and many of these correspond very closely with what we know of Zarathustra. For instance, he says, and I'm quoting from Beelzebub's Tales here, and this is from the 1950 edition. The very saintly Ashiata Shiemash was the only messenger sent from above to your planet, who by his holy labors succeeded in creating conditions in which for a certain time the existence of its unfortunate beings somewhat resembled the existence of three-brained beings with the same possibilities that inhabit other planets of our great universe. In so many words, he is saying that this prophet is the only one who is actually successful in creating peace on earth. The aim that every other prophet touts but never really accomplishes. In a more esoteric sense, what this really means is that mankind generally achieved objective consciousness for a time, one of the practical results of which, of course, would be relative peace on earth. It is often said of Zarathustra that this was accomplished during the reign of Cyrus II of Persia, founder of the Achaemenid Empire, 600 to 530 BC, which followed the teachings of Zarathustra and was well known as one of the most peaceful and prosperous societies in history. Cyrus respected the customs and religions of the lands he conquered, followed a successful model of administration working to the advantage and profit of its subjects. He also freed the Jews in Babylon and earned a special distinction in the Jewish Bible as Messiah, and is the only non-Jew to be so called. It is also possible that the Jews of Babylon under Cyrus were influenced by the monotheistic model of Zoroastrianism, and it is widely recognized by scholars that Zarathustra taught the first form of monotheism. Here again we find a reference to this aspect of Mazdaism in Beelzebub's Tales, in which the word Olbogmek, which means there are no different religions, there is only one God, from Beelzebub's Tales, page 319. And indeed, Zarathustra is universally acknowledged by scholars of producing the first form of monotheism. Another idea that Gurdjieff introduces is the ideas of Legominism and essence exchange. Ashiata's teaching method differs radically from anything done by any teacher before or any teacher after. He taught without teaching. He says, the very saintly Ashiata Shiemash taught nothing whatever to the ordinary three-brained beings of earth, nor did he preach anything to them, as was done before and after him by all the other messengers sent from above with the same aim. In other words, there's a very distinctive form of essence exchange suggested by this system, something more than writings, something not obtainable by the one-way authoritarian structure followed by the great forms of monotheism and church Christianity. It is also here in the narrative of Beelzebub that the idea of Legominism is introduced. A Legominism, Beelzebub tells us, is the name given to one of the means used there for transmitting from generation to generation information about certain events of long past ages through those three-brained beings who have become worthy to be and to be called initiates. In other places, Gurdjieff had spoken of great physical works like the Sphinx or the Gothic cathedrals, but here he refers to a legomenism called the terror of the situation. In the work of this idea is known in the shock of realizing one's own mechanical nature, which can be tied back to one's wish for being, or one's being conscience. As we shall see, conscience also has a central role in Zarathustra's teaching as well. As Beelzebub concludes, Legominism is the name given to the successive transmission of information about long past events on the planet Earth from initiate to initiate of the first kind, that is, between really meritorious beings transmitting what they themselves have received from similar meritorious beings. In other words, Legominism is the unique form of essential transfer developed by Ashiata Shiemash. Now, in the realm of the idea of conscience, it is clear in Beelzebub's tales that the significance of conscience pervades the teachings of Ashiata Shiemash, that it is central to his teachings, and that all of his other ideas revolve around it. He says, after the second as Beelzebub says, after the second Transapolnian perturbation occurred to this ill-starred planet, that is, after the loss of Atlantis, the action of the cosmic law of Solunensius in the common presence of your favorites took place at least 40 times. And each time, thanks to this strange need of freedom which has become fixed in the majority of them, almost the same thing took place as has recently been occurring among the groups inhabiting that part of the surface of your planet called Russia. Here it is extremely important to note that these terrifying processes could never have occurred among the three-brained beings of the planet Earth if those data for engendering the being impulse of conscience, which had remained intact in their subconscious data, to which the most saintly Ashiata Shiemash was the first to turn his attention, and which he relied upon for the fulfillment of his mission, had taken part in the functioning of that consciousness of theirs, which has become habitual for them during their waking state. It is only because the data for the sacred impulse of being conscious do not take part in the functioning of this consciousness of theirs that the action of a law, a sol unensius, as well as of other inevitable cosmic laws, assumes these abnormal forms which are so lamentable for them. Many significant ideas can be found in this passage. To begin with, in calling him the first, Beelzebub is saying not only was Ashiata the first to identify the importance of conscience, but that the word fully supported and defined his existence and mission on earth. This further suggested that there is an actual biological, even medical benefit to conscience. The Beelzebub word solunensius is like a kind of lunacy only from the sun. Dangerous radiations from the sun make people crazy, make them want to kill other beings. There's actually sociological support for this, as statistically homicide and violent crime rates tend to increase the closer one gets to the equator, where the influence of the sun is obviously more apparent, felt more strongly by the people who live there. Conscience, or the development of being conscious, can protect us from these deleterious influences. Thus, the development of conscience goes hand in hand with the discouragement of animal sacrifice, and really violence in general. Conscience also can be seen to emerge with a central importance in the teachings of Zarathustra, and we find evidence of it in key ideas like Dana Vahuni, which is often translated as good conscience. There is also the story of Zarathustra speaking out against animal sacrifice, and this is spoken of actually in the Gathas, the earliest form of verbal documentation in Zoroastrianism, and believed to be the words of Zarathustra himself, in which he praised that the needless slaughter of the sacred cattle would stop. Now, as much as these correspondences between the historic Zarathustra and Ashiata Shiemash may inspire and intrigue us, I also have to state that there is an alternative theory that Ashiata Shiemash is actually a character in the future. I believe Gurdjieff actually said this himself at some point, that it's actually about someone in the future. He suggested it cryptically. While we find specific things like this that might relate, it is hard to say for sure. But one historical event that certainly most definitely ties Ashiata Shiemash to Zarathustra is Beelzebub's Tales actually references Alexander of Macedonia, who historically we know slaughtered the Zoroastrian priesthood and ended much of Zoroastrian's general and open practice. Much of Zoroastrianism went into more of a clandestine kind of mode after that, and then also many Zoroastrians had migrated to India following all of this. But this is referred to specifically in Beelzebub's Tales, that Alexander of Macedonia ended the last final effects of the continued good teachings of Ashiata Shiemash, which is a reference to, well, the teachings that he set in motion had been carried on for quite a while after that, and were finally ended by Alexander of Macedonia. One of the things that is absent that has always kind of bothered me about this theory is that you don't see mentioned anywhere in Beelzebub's Tales the good thoughts, good words, good deeds of Zoroastrianism, which is probably the most common, most popular, at least nowadays, part of it, which I think also comes from the Gathas. That does not appear in Beelzebub's Tales. However, he accredits Ashiata Shiemash for introducing the triad of faith, hope, and love, which of course appears in the New Testament. It's one of the key teachings of Jesus Christ, which is another messenger from beyond who also bears many similarities to Zarathustra. So that's enough for now to keep us thinking and reflecting on these things. what is important, I think, is that we find the key ideas in here. And one of the main ones is conscience, the development of conscience. And Beelzebub's Tales goes into more depth in this about how this was brought about through Ashiata Shiemash's teachings, which largely appear to be a stillness and silence practice, which allows for this conscience to be rebuilt in this time period after it had been lost. Ashiata Shiemash's scenario takes place after the fallen state of humanity, where conscience and other things, the ability to perceive reality accurately, has in general been lost amongst mankind. And through these practices, they were able to bring back conscience for a time for mankind. So the importance of conscience is really the key thing. And if you go over to the, which comes out of the New Testament, this is also around conscience. It's around the efforts of faith, hope, and love are about developing conscience. They're about developing a sense of wish for something higher that can transform us. The other thing that would keep you from going, oh yeah, that's it, that's just, Gurdjieff got everything from Zarathustra, which I really don't think that that's the case. I think rather it's more the case that there was a central teaching which fragmented into a few different areas. And this is part of the opening of Beelzebub's Tales, goes through this historic prehistory, which is associated with Atlantis. He calls it Atlantis is the original society of Accaldans, the first group of enlightened beings, and when their society experienced a cataclysm or a fall, the teachings were disseminated into 3 different areas. Basically, Persia, Egypt, and the Far East. Egypt, which would eventually, obviously, as ancient Egyptian ideas, but also it ends up encoded in the teachings of Jesus Christ. Persia, where the teachings become deciphered by the prophet Zarathustra, and then East Asia, which I'm not sure if I can fully encapsulate it into one individual. I want to say Lao Tzu and Taoism as being the earliest manifestation of this, simply because it's more similar with the ideas in Taoism. I find more correspondence with these other ideas that we've been talking about. But Gurdjieff, I think, refers it more to Tibet. So that might actually be a more accurate thing. I'm not sure the historicity of it, but eventually Lama's in Tibet, but he traces back the Saint Lama to Saint Buddha, and eventually back to Saint Krishna Karna, or to Krishna. So it's a more complicated line, but that's kind of the line that goes into the Far East, as near as I can tell. But the point is that we find these similar elements, and specifically conscience as being like really the key one, and the need to develop that in relation to a principle of cosmic order, Asha, the Tao, Mat, a principle of cosmic order that is based upon a hierarchy which reaches up into eventually to the absolute and connects us with the divine. So, with those thoughts of the divine that is beyond us, I will wish you all the best, and that you keep on fighting the good fight. Ushtate.